Hello, thank you all so much for coming. My name is Amelia Shapiro, and I'm going to be talking to you today about PRC cyber attack motivations in big medical data. I work for an offensive security research company called Margin Research in New York. And this research was funded by ARPA-H, so a big thanks to them. Okay, so this is where we're hoping to sort of get at the end of this talk. I am trying to rank targets in terms of how interested I believe, based on this research, China is in acquiring them. And we're going to talk about why later. This month and this upcoming year is going to be a bellwether year for big data medical hacking in the PRC. I'm going to come back to this slide later, so don't worry, and I'll publish slides. Okay, so this is what the outline of the talk is going to look like. We're going to start by talking about sort of why cyber attacks might be involved in Chinese medical big data, because that doesn't necessarily make that much sense initially, so we're going to talk through that. Then once we determine that these sort of maybe more economically centered state goals are targets for cyber attacks, we're going to try to wonder, okay, what are those state goals? And so we're going to try to diagram those out. And then once we have those state goals, we're going to say, okay, which parts of the US medical infrastructure is China going to be most interested in targeting given these state goals? So let's start with the first thing, the most simple one. So why are this medical data, why is the medical data likely to be a target of a cyber attack? Why is US medical data likely to be a target of a cyber attack that is state-sponsored? That feels really weird, right? Because a lot of the output of medical data is going to be medical research, which feels academic, or is going to be economic development, which feels, commercial. So what's with this commercial sort of military or securitized connection? So for all the people who study China in the audience, me saying military civil fusion up here isn't going to be shocking. But what happens is, if you have a commercial goal that wraps in to a national security goal, as I'm going to show you that this medical big data actually does, then it becomes a target for state backed cyber attacks, or the target of state national security infrastructure. And we see this across sectors. So we've seen it for shipbuilding, we've seen it for semis, we've seen it for vaccines in the medical data sector. Once you sort of involve the national security aspect, then you end up involving, in the commercial sense, then you end up involving it in the cyber attack sense. So this is my slide that goes out to all of you DoD folks out there, if anybody's watching on YouTube or whatever. I know you all love a crazy slide. So what I did here is I diagrammed out the 14th five-year planning documents across all these slides will be on the internet, across a bunch of different planning documents. So I looked at the 14th five-year plan for the bioeconomy, the 14th five-year plan for pharmaceuticals, and the 14th five-year plan for long-range objectives for 2035. So these planning documents are really important. They are they're the central authority in China telling us what the plan is for the next 5 years. In the past, they haven't necessarily always been fulfilled, but as of late, in the Xi Jinping era, we're seeing more and more of those goals being sort of either met or a good attempt is made if it's in this document. And so in the red here, that's a section header in the 14th five-year plan on the bioeconomy, so that's a really big deal. And that's a tactical deal. The bioeconomy is more of a tactical plan, and the National Economic and Social Development Goal, which is in the green, is more of a strategic plan. And so what we can see down here towards the bottom is that the ability to treat trauma and illness, a healthy aging population, fertility. These are all a big part of China's population and aging concerns that are, and fertility concerns that are starting to present a huge population-based national security threat to China in the coming years. And then on the other side, we have an interest in bringing in biotechnology researchers and IP. And so the red is sort of how they're kind of going to go about fixing these things, how they're going to support these goals tactically. And so one of the things that we see is this pandemic-related supply chains, pandemic response, and pandemic-related biotechnology, all of which are areas where we have seen China use cyber attacks to support those goals. What I'm interested in up here is the red, this big medical data integration, which they have significantly highlighted, and which is, as I'm going to show in the next slide, way further upstream than these other goals. And so if they're willing to use cyber attacks to support these other goals, why not big medical data integration? Well, for the most part, I think largely because at the moment, they can, well, up until about a month ago, they could buy big medical data. And that is coming to a stop, and I'll talk about that later. So one of the things that I always look for when I am looking at sort of Chinese planning documents is upstream versus downstream. So why am I interested in upstream versus downstream? I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. But the upstream here is this big medical data is the only significantly highlighted section header in the upstream, in the way upstream, is that big medical data. So that to me says, okay, this is something that is really important. But why? Why do we care about the upstream? So this is because China has this national security or just general development playbook, which we saw go into effect for cars in incredible work done by Amelia de la Bruyere. So the idea is that if you are lagging behind on research or IP, and you don't necessarily know how to fix that, one of the ways that you can do that is by controlling everything that is upstream or that has to come before the downstream research. And by controlling the upstream, you're able to force people to come to you, to build technology where you are, and to train your researchers. And when you do that, you end up being able to transfer, get a hold of some of that IP, and continue downstream and not have to do as much of the basic research and development that you might have to do otherwise. So this is how it happened for electric vehicles. You got mineral mines, and then you got batteries, and then finally you ended up with electric vehicles. So in the biotech sector, I would argue that based on those planning documents and based on the way that planning documents looked for electric vehicles in about 2008, China has the same plan for medical data mines, where medical data mines are you and me, our genetic data, our health data. So the idea is you start with medical data mines, you extend that down into big medical data that is easily integratable, and then you finally push that further downstream into fields like precision medicine and stem cells, all of those fields that are highlighted in the 14th Five-Year Plan on the for the bioeconomy downstream that directly lead into national security goals, like fertility or having a population that can continue to work past 60. So why use this strategy? Mostly because it takes advantage of a lot of China's competitive advantages. So for the mineral market, that is a lack of environmental concerns. That is a lack of significant human rights concerns for the laborers who are working in mineral refinement factories. A few other sort of main areas, but more apropos, the medical data mines. What does China have that the US doesn't have? The ability to consolidate. The US has HIPAA, right? If one medical data source has your data, they can't just share it without your consent with other medical data sources willy-nilly throughout the system and consolidate it all in one place. That's illegal. You can't do that. So that allows, if you don't have those restrictions and you do pick winners and you're able to put all that data in one place, that gives you a significant strategic advantage. Another advantage is sort of the ability to force a huge amount of your population to submit to genetic testing that you then take and put in your databases. That's another pretty big competitive advantage, which again, I'm quite glad that the US is not doing. Please don't do that. Along with other industrial policy incentives. Okay, so if you don't trust me that China does care a lot about bioinformatics, this is the slide for you in terms of national security, right? Because if there's no national security in there, the hacking is much less likely to be funded by the government. It might be, but I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying it's less likely. So here we've got biosafety is related to the health of the people, long-term stability of the country. I mean, if that's not national security, what is? Overall national security, important force, and then later down we see that we are looking at national strategic research platforms such as bioinformatics, human genetic, resource preservation. So a lot of this is about vaccines. A lot of this is a post-COVID phenomenon, but not all of it is. This idea that this is going to be crucial to being able to control health in the future, to when the next big thing breaks out, to be ahead of it, to be able to control how the world reacts. And also to be at the forefront in terms of biotech in general, to be able to best treat your people. Okay, but so China's saying they're gonna do this, right? Are they actually doing it? That's always a big question. So we're gonna talk through 4 ways that we know that they're doing it. The first is they've identified these as areas for export, and these sort of topics that will get big medical data back into China for export, and they're doing that. Then there's data sharing laws, so how China is sort of regulating people into that system and regulating in that data, and keeping it, controlling it, not letting anyone else get it. And then finally, nationally funded biotechnology research. So, first of all, we have these plans for export. So these plans to export high-end medical devices, genetic testing, pharmaceutical R&D services, and then internet diagnosis and treatment. If you look at these, all of these are really good ways to collect foreign genetic data. So why would China want to collect foreign genetic data? Largely because it's a little bit different than Chinese genetic data. And if you want to create solutions that are going to be able to be exported to the rest of the world, you have to have a wider genetic base to test on. Part of it is that it's not just genetic data, it's many other kinds of data. So you've got, for example, if you are testing a drug, you're gonna want that kind of data. If you are, you might want things related to blood pressure. With the prevalence of AI and proteomics, any kind of medical data that you can just use in the aggregate and plug and chug and get something out is huge in terms of development. And so often China doesn't necessarily have the proliferation of the fancy machines that we have in the US, where across hospitals we're getting this really fantastic data on many, many people. Because of the Chinese healthcare system, the data isn't necessarily as high fidelity. And so to be able to get that US data can be extremely valuable, and many other countries as well. So then we've got PRC data sharing laws. So basically, there are new-ish laws in China that say if you're collecting information about people in China, you have to send it to the Chinese government, and if it's too sensitive, you can't export it at all, and health is often deemed really sensitive, so you just can't export health data. This is, again, one of those little COVID artifacts as well, where I don't think many of you will be shocked by this. We have BGI's record of, rather than just buying the genetic material, coming to the US, setting up fertility clinics, and collecting genetic data that it sends back to China, which I love so much. Through prenatal tests that are free, which the way that they're targeting, I don't love it. Okay. So finally, we've got science funding data. This is the most interesting thing to me. So what I did here is I looked at the aggregate of NSFC funding in medicine and life sciences by sub-area. And I measured it in USD rather than renminbi because I thought that would be easier for my audience to understand. And then I also looked at the national lab system in China, and I'm comparing the two. So when you look at the NNSFC data, most of this is going to be more immediately applicable. It's going to be stuff that you're going to be trying to use immediately. When you look at national labs, that's more basic research. And so when you look at the overlap between what's really big in national labs and what's really big in it's a tongue twister, it's fine. What you're going to see is that actually animal and human genetics is really big in both. Medical and Chinese traditional medicine and cancer medicine and neuroscience, they're all immediately useful right now. Animal and human genetics is not necessarily such a big sector. That's a very specific sector to be so big. And so that to me, again, says, okay, we're supporting this particular goal. So based on all of this, what kind of medical data do we think China is most interested in? So first of all, they're going to be interested in data that is useful for biotechnology, big data research. They're going to want stuff that's plug and chug because not everybody necessarily has the educational background to be able to clean data, to be able to figure out what it all means. So any kind of thing you can just stick into a program and get stuff out of will be especially of interest. Especially data that relates to sectors that are not, to kinds of information that are not easily accessible in China. So again, that can be people of different backgrounds, that can be people who exist in different circumstances, so epigenetics, or just people who work in areas that aren't common in China that might have medical indicators. As well, people who have received kinds of medical care that aren't always available easily in China, and things that, sorry, I forgot where I was on here. Climates unlike those. And so all of these things where if you can think of a reason you couldn't really get it in China, that would be a really good reason that they would want to try to get it. So to me, here's what this target tier list looks like. Infectious disease IP. I haven't talked about this because we all know China is trying to hack vaccine companies and steal vaccine data. Tale as old as time. We've caught them a bunch of times. So I didn't think I needed to go over it. In fact, I think the fact that this ends up this high up here is maybe a signifier that maybe we should look at these other things. So software necessary to analyze big biomedical data, easily formatted biomedical data, and technology that's upstream of medical data. So there you have genetic testing chips, which China is very big on manufacturing right now. So why am I talking about this now, right? We're not seeing all of this right now. We're not seeing that much hacking of this stuff right now. And it might be that China's doing a really good job and staying under the surface, but I don't think that's why. I think it's because, for the most part, recently, China's just been buying it. We've been allowing the sale and export of this data to China for years now. So why would this change? Well, we can draw conclusions about other strategic US goals, like the one I'm about to talk about, from information about Chinese cyber attack patterns on the US medical infrastructure. So I'm not the only person who's talking about this. A lot of people have noticed. They have in the past put out export controls and sanctions. There was supposed to be a Biosecure Act that was going to regulate this. But more recently, in July, a regulation from the DOJ went into effect that banned the export of genetic data with some pretty significant punishments to those who actually go about and do it, including criminal charges of genetic data, US proteomic data, and other kinds of US sensitive data. And they have closed a lot of loopholes that are usually there. So that's really interesting to me. That says China isn't going to be able to get this information that they're interested in a different way. So if they can no longer go about collecting this data through investing in US companies, through putting plants in US companies, through just buying this data outright, they're not just going to stop trying to get it. That's just not how they roll. And so I would expect to see a huge uptick in hacking of the of this medical data that they are so interested in, of the bioeconomy relevant data. And I would expect to see it in the next year. So this leads to an odd conclusion, right? If we see an uptick in cyber attacks on bioinformation in the next year, that's a great thing. I will be so excited if we see that, because that will mean that our regulations are actually working. I don't know yet whether they're going to work. If any of you do, please let me know. But I have no idea. So that would mean that our plans to limit the transfer of data are working. Fantastic. On the other hand, if we don't see an uptick of cyber attacks in this sector, it could be that China's being really good about being stealthy, but based on how they went about the whole vaccine thing, I mean, we're probably going to catch something. It probably means that our attempts to stop PRC entities from accessing US medical data are failing. And so even though in this conference we're always wanting to talk about, okay, we want to stop cyber attacks, right? We don't want these things to happen. In this case, I'd actually really love to see them. Okay, thank you so much, and I'd love to take any questions you guys have. Yeah.
What about other countries outside of the United States? Obviously there are a lot of other populations, non-Chinese populations, Europe, other places. Any indication that you see that they're doing the same thing, doing other regions?
So I really only look at the US and China, but I would love to get back to you on that. Other questions? Yeah. Okay, so the question was, do I expect to see the targeting of hospitals or maybe more laboratory type scenarios, VA? Yeah, government managed data systems, absolutely. I have no idea because I am not necessarily a US healthcare specialist. And I don't necessarily know where the most interesting data is stored in the most insecure ways. And I think that if that's something that, so this talk, the reason I'm giving it is to try to let the people who do know a lot about the US medical sector know what Chinese targeting is likely to look like, not to tell them sort of where it's gonna go, to be able to hope that they like ask themselves, is my data gonna be of interest? But I can't give really good answers on sort of what kinds of data are the least well protected and the most efficient to gain. My guess would be all of it, based on what we saw with vaccines, everything. Other questions? Kieran.
So obviously the focus of this talk was specifically on aggressive behavior.
Yeah.
Where or what manifestations of behavior would you expect to see down the line, specifically from the medical industry, if we take as true that like the CMCs or the Chinese leadership is becoming increasingly risky?
Yeah, so this is interesting because, right, I think the question was, what would I expect to see given that it seems like Chinese leadership is getting increasingly risk tolerant at attacking? I would not expect to see necessarily a lot of taking down of critical infrastructure based on this, because the interest is more so in theft than it is in shutting things down that I'm seeing here. What I would expect to see is that those sort of government-directed holders of data being targeted where they might not otherwise, where only commercial vendors might be otherwise. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you all so much for coming.